Ben Winchester is our guest today, and he is a rural sociologist and a senior research fellow for the University of Minnesota. Ben says the story of rural America since 1970 is rich and diverse, with positive trends occurring under the radar. These important positive changes will have an impact on, require all of us to rewrite the narrative of rural community change. Ben will speak for a full 60 minutes, so please settle in with your cup of coffee and enjoy it. If you choose to stay, there will be time for questions and announcements from others at the end. So thanks a lot for joining us. Ben?
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks for having me here today. Welcome, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to be able to share this lifelong work of mine with you all here today. Let me get set up here with the screen sharing real quick. So you're gonna bear with me for 1 second. Okay, and Nancy, I think you may. I'm gonna swap this quick. Okay. How's that look there, Nancy?
It is not sized correctly again. I'm going to, okay, now it's good.
Okay, great. Well, so I'm going to turn off my video here too for the folks that might have low bandwidth connections. So you see the title here is Rewriting the Rural Narrative. What you hear today is really, I think, a needed change in tone, change in voice about how we talk about our rural communities. And I think, as you well know, rural communities kind of get a bad rap. Everybody thinks they're dying and, there's nothing left. We're all that's left are the people who couldn't get out in a sense. And that the narrative is wholly negative, and that ultimately that narrative isn't really written by us, it's written for us. And a lot of times we just run with that narrative because we think that's the way it must be, right? So my premise here is that the narrative we're using to describe our small towns is straight out of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and really is not current. You'll see the subtitle here is Speak Softly and Carry Statistics. I'm a data geek. My undergraduate was in math and statistics. I love to explore data sets, but I know most people don't like data, don't like to look at tables of information. So hopefully information that you hear today will be consumable, understandable, and really something you can take home with yourself. So kind of my own background was math and stats. That was my undergraduate. I went to graduate school at the University of Missouri and in rural sociology. But even while I was doing my undergraduate work, I was the first employee at an organization called the Center for Small Towns. And this is located in Morris, Minnesota, where one of the satellite campuses is located for the University of Minnesota. And it's there that I first started to get involved in small towns and how easy it was to make an impact on small towns. And then Roger McCannon, who was the head of continuing education at the time, right after I graduated, said, "Hey, Ben, we're starting up this new group called the Center for Small Towns. Do you want to be the first employee?" And I was like, great. I didn't have a job. I mean, I think generally as a student, you think you're going to work for a company and that you're going to move to the metro. And so I started to realize there's all these kinds of groups doing rural development work. And who are they? Like there's the foundation world, the nonprofit world, there's extension, there's regional development commissions. In Minnesota, we have initiative foundations. Really there's what Randy Cantrell and I call the rural development industry out there, which really isn't well known outside of the industry itself, I'll say. So as I started to get my feet wet doing rural development work, of course, as an academic, I want to read books, I want to follow articles, I want to see who's talking about rural and in what ways they're doing that. And generally, this is what you see, right? People keep leaving rural America, small towns are playing a role in their own demise, which I love that one. From breadbasket to basket case, this was in a major national newspaper and is probably one of the most disrespectful headlines I've ever read. I think mental health professionals would agree with this, that if we want to kind of comically call the entire central part of our country a basket case, and there's nobody really here to counter this narrative. These are the headlines. These are what millions of people read every day. Minnesota, of course, I'm in Minnesota, but this research is applicable generally everywhere. Rural Minnesota's in trouble. Poster child for the war on poverty. I mean, like there's a county in Appalachia that has the lowest per capita in the country. And so every year when the new BEA data comes out about income, and they're on the bottom, the New York Times and the Washington Post, they trot the reporters down to this county and they start to ask people like, what's it like to be poor, right? As if like that is how they define themselves, as if that's how people really define their lives. They don't. We know this. At the same time, we've got a lot of books out there: Decline of Rural Minnesota, Fighting for an American Countryside, Survival of Rural America. And many of you may know this Hollowing Out the Middle book. This is about the rural brain drain. And if you don't know, the rural brain drain is when our high school students, when they graduate, they move out and they go to the metro or they go to the military. And apparently this is hollowing out our towns to the point that towns start to feel really bad that they're losing their high school graduates. And while on one hand, you should ensure that they've got opportunities in town, on the other hand, are you going to tell an 18-year-old that they can't leave? Like, you're going to tell an 18-year-old, like, how valuable is that advice going to be? I talk about a quick way to build resentment, right? So anyway, we'll talk more about this because I think this essentially became part and parcel of what I thought about rural communities, right? We've got this brain drain, nobody's left. But I will let you know, if you use the term brain drain from an international perspective, they will almost laugh at how we're defining it. Because how are we defining brain drain? It's the loss of our 18-year-olds. But internationally, when you talk about brain drain, and there are countries that experience this, China, India, they are losing their top engineers, their PhD doctors, right? Brain drain to them means losing the most educated in their country. So if I were to talk about the brain drain of rural America and they're like, oh, you're losing your high school kids, I feel really bad for you. You know, we just lost all of our engineers last year. So FYI, this becomes part and parcel of the narrative that we use to describe our small towns. And literally there are stacks of articles, stacks of books that talk about outmigration of people from our rural communities as if there is nobody ever moving in. And we will look at this. So there is this narrative out there. There's a brain drain. We live in the middle of nowhere, right? I'm sure we all use these terms. We are a sleepy town, and that's especially like you see this in the newspaper. This, sleepy town was woken up by a murder, as if, the town was doing nothing until this event happened, right? Everybody knows one another. False. Nobody locks their doors. False, right? So we've got we've got this narrative that we continually see and gets reified and reinforced in media and publications. And really a lot of this narrative is based on the past. It's based on what we had or what we don't have or what we wish we had or what we could have had. I've shared this with a number of groups, but I mean, there are so many towns that have this narrative of opportunity lost, right? Like we could have had this big manufacturer in town 40 years ago if we'd have just rezoned that parcel of land. Now, whether or not that's not true, a lot of times it's actually false. But in many ways, when you examine the language that's used by current residents, a lot of it is like, we could have had blank, right? As if it's a rationale, because ultimately these communities are in places they don't believe they should be. So then they find these rationales for why they are the way they are. So we are going to explore this narrative. One commonality amongst all this is that generally our rural communities are defined through deficits. It's, what we used to have or some comparative analysis between urban places. And I used to tell my boss, Roger McKenna, at the time when I first started, because again, the narrative is all negative. It's about dying communities and what can we do to, somehow stabilize ourselves. And I said, boy, it sounds like I'm going to be this, critical care assistant for our small towns to help them die in a peaceful way. Because ultimately, right, what's going right with small towns? Nothing. So really might as well just help them, close up shop in a way that's not going to hurt them too much. Well, that aside, I want to introduce a term here called anecdata. Anecdata is information which is presented as if it's based on serious research, when in fact it's based on what somebody thinks is true. We are filled with this, right? Around coffee tables, around cafes, you hear about like such and such. I really don't like this town, or this town used to have this, or we just lost this last week. And whether or not it's true, you don't really know. But I want to remind you that as a data geek, the plural of anecdote is not data. It is not a trend when three people talk about how bad their town is. We want to ensure that we get everybody's voices on board here and be able to move forward from that. So looking back, we have gone through dramatic changes in our small towns. The mechanization of agriculture alone in the early 1900s reduced the farm workers by 10 to 40, 60% in some places. At the same time, roads and transportation systems, which are now just 100 years old, they transformed our communities. When you went from an isolated community to one that was connected by roads and able to get there and back in the morning, this changed not only how our small towns saw themselves, but how they interacted with their neighbors. And this led to the growth of many regional centers. It actually led to a lot of different vibrancy and a lot of different competition. So this made the world smaller. I mean, we talk about technology today making the world smaller. Well, imagine what roads did during the same time frame. Again, just 100 years ago that we went through that. Educational achievement, I like to talk about the GI Bill. Post-World War II, the GI Bill afforded an opportunity for rural residents many times for the first time ever to get a college degree and bring this back home and start to make, I would say, better decisions, better understand the world. You know what education does for our communities and the ability for us to better ourselves and not rely upon outside experts. And I think extension has been part and parcel of this, is helping people make these decisions in good ways. And then we've also got churches closing, and it wasn't always churches closing. It may have closed because it went from being the only church in town to now we've got, the Lutherans have moved into town. So it's not all the Catholics in town. So, we've got this kind of diversity that started to express itself in the early 1900s. 1950 and on, we really started to see, this is a very kind economist way of saying businesses are closing. Main Street restructuring. Here's Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, and I think this is the idyllic view of what people have of small towns, is that, a small town, it's, a filled main street with cars and people are walking around. And well, how many towns do you see that look like this today? You don't. We have gone through dramatic economic changes. We've lost grocery stores and hardware stores and apothecaries, and you can't have 4 gas stations in town. And almost every one of these events is marked by a headline that says, if we lose our grocery store, our small town's going to die. If we lose our hardware store, our small town's going to die. If we lose our blank, right? I mean, it's just this proclamation of death, one thing after another. And but I want to remind you that, these businesses didn't close because people should have shopped more locally. Maybe they could have, but we've got lower incomes and we work now in regional centers and not so much in every town. And so we started to see this shift of ownership too, from local ownership to non-local ownership. But ultimately, I want to remind you that losing your hardware stores or losing your grocery stores is not a rural thing. This is called globalization. And these trends impacting our commercial sectors are not unique to rural communities. These happen everywhere. So every time you hear of a hardware store closing in one of your small towns, there's one that closed in Wichita too. But in Wichita, you've got 3 to 5 other options in 5 miles to go to a grocery store. But if you lose your grocery store in a small town, now it's probably your only one. And this has a fairly significant negative impact on the psyche and identity of that small town. As you drive up and down Main Street and you see boarded building and boarded up building, things look different. And it's easy to say this small town is dying. There's really not much left. And then we hit the whammy of school consolidations in the 80s and 90s. Schools started to consolidate. And again, the narrative in town is like, boy, if it wasn't for open enrollment, we'd probably still be open. Or, private schools, they're just the demise of our small town school. And so we went from having full K-12 schools to having, an elementary school in one town, the high school in the neighboring town, or sometimes you lost all of them. And you put a school in the middle of the countryside. So really, the number one, none of those reasonings are true in terms of why schools consolidated. The number one reason why schools consolidated is the birth rate. So when you went from having 100 kids enter kindergarten in 1985 to in the year 2000, that number went down to 50, that has a significant impact on the ability of a school to sustain itself. So because it is the birth rate. I kind of comically say, you want to do something about, low school enrollment, start having pro-fertility days in your small towns and encourage your community to start repopulating its kindergarten class. But, we used to have 4 kids and now we have 2. It's just, it's a change in household structure, and we'll look at that too. Now we've got this narrative around, our small towns are dying because of hospitals closing or birthing centers. So all of these things seem like one more nail in the coffin of our small towns. And it's easy when you walk through or drive through a small town to think there's nothing left, especially when a majority of the people leave town every day to go work in a regional center, for example. So now, what we do have is, when we look nationally at what rural is, I think a lot of people first and foremost think of farming. Well, 95% of rural employees in this country are not engaged in ag or an ag-related field today. Ag hasn't been the primary industry in rural America for 65 years. In fact, agriculture has come and went as the primary industry. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a role. I'm saying it's not the primary. Manufacturing has come and went as the primary provider of jobs, where today education and health services now make up more than 1/3 of all jobs in our rural communities. When you think about like education, health services, it is caring for people. It is, professional services is in there too, but ultimately, like we care for each other in our rural communities. So I did a study a number of years ago that looked at how to do the metropolitan media portray rural Minnesota. And, aside from the fact there were stereotypes galore, like in this small town where everybody knows one another, right? So anyway, we did this study for the McKnight Foundation to examine the content of these stories. But one aspect of the study that I did was I asked reporters, like, what time of day did you get out to our small towns from your metropolitan homes? And the average time of day that the reporters got out to our small towns was between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Well, who are you going to find in your small towns between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m.? Not much. It's certainly not going to look like Sleepy Eye today, right? Because we don't have these businesses open. So the reporter kind of drives up and down Main Street and sees like boarded up buildings or maybe a boarded up school. And it just reaffirms this bias that this reporter has that the small towns are dying. So they go on to the cafe, and who do you find in the cafe but the retired farmers who talk about how life used to be? And nowhere do we have any challenge to the narrative that rural is dying. So, meanwhile, recently we've had, I just want to share this, recently we have had, in the past 2-3 years here, an increased discussion. This was the first story I found about potential post office closings. And so the Star Tribune in Minneapolis had sent this reporter up to Calumet, which is west of Duluth, Minnesota, a small town. And of course, like everybody likes talking to the reporter, and the reporter's asking people like, what's the impact of losing your post office going to have on your life? And, things like that. And what ends up in the newspaper is a very distilled version, right? Because that reporter just had 40 different quotes, and what you see is a very distilled version of this entire narrative. And so what we find is this. So here's the title of the story as it appeared. The Iron Range town is fighting for more than the mail. Calumet challenges the decision to close its post office, which is a social hub for its residents. And like, social hub? I couldn't even get past social hub to read the article because I lived in Hancock, Minnesota, a town of 700 people for 12 years, and never once did I hang out in the post office. We don't have a coffee machine. There's no rolls there. I mean, it's almost comical, and you can laugh at this until you realize how many people just read this. And now how many people are like, oh my gosh, those people hang out in their post office. Now, this is serious business. Now we're talking about how a dominant narrative can influence perceptions of reality. And you know this, how we talk about ourselves, it can reify itself, whether or not the data supports it. So the point here is rural areas are changing, they're not dying. In many ways, small towns are microcosms of globalization. Like, you want to understand how the world is changing? Look to small towns, because those changes are happening there many times first. So, but I want to remind you that we've survived all this massive restructuring of social and economic systems, right? And we've done it with volunteers. Imagine how resilient do you have to be to survive these massive changes with your volunteer school boards, volunteer chambers. So I don't think we give ourselves as much credit as we should. And really, I just want to follow this up by saying, you know, the research base out there does not support the notion that if something closes, your town is going to die. It's just not going to happen. I mean, you know, essentially, my point is, if all of these changes were going to predict the death of your small town, show me all the dead towns. Show me all the towns that are dying, and we'll look at some of this. So, since 1970, the rural population has not gone down, it's gone up by 11%. So, and we call this the rural rebound. It has gone up by 11%, but what's gone down is the relative percentage of Americans that live in a rural place. In 1970, 1 in 4 people lived in a rural place, but by 2010, that went down to 1 in 5 people. Well, how can that be? I thought the population went up by 11%. Like this area of the pie that's rural, the red part got bigger by 11%. But what happened was the urban growth rate was 50%, which results in a relative decline in the rural population as a proportion, but not an absolute decline in numbers. So, but meanwhile, this is almost the headline, always the headline here. Like, you know, the U.S. population continues to prefer city life is the headline almost all the time. And they ignore, blatantly, you know, disregard the fact that the rural population has actually went up. So now, at the same time, many of our rural communities have gone through and become urbanized, especially around the metropolitan area. So you can look yourself around the metro areas. You know, your metropolitan areas have not grown taller, they've grown wider. And why have they grown wider? It's because people in their, as they age, do not prefer to live in urban environments, core urban environments. And, you know, recall this, like how many counties were in your metropolitan areas in like 40 years ago, and how many are in there today? In Kansas, since 1974, 12 counties have been reclassified from rural to urban. 417,000 residents. So essentially your rural, quote unquote, rural population went down by 15%, but it's not because people moved out of those communities, it's a reclassification issue. 15% of your people were reclassified from rural to urban. And that is because ultimately, you know, there was first ring suburbs around your urban areas that got grown out in the 40s and 50s. But then in the 60s, 70s, 80s, people are like, well, I don't want to live in that first ring suburb. That's urban. I'm going to move out. And then you start to see people move into those small towns, which then again become urban areas. So this is not a new trend, you know, but it definitely negatively impacts, you know, my statistics, our statistics in rural communities makes it look like there's decline when it's not true. There is actually a preference for rural living. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about total population infatuation. And hopefully I'm going to give you some ammo here. My last name is Winchester, right? I'm going to give you ammo. I'm going to give you ammo to fight using total population as any indicator for success or failure. So typically everybody loves the total population numbers, right? Did our population go up or did it go down, right? So here in the lost counties, we see a bunch of losers here. Look at all these loser counties that lost population overall. And these are the winners, the recreational places, the urban areas. But really, what is going on here? So let's talk about this. Oops, my little things are highlighted wrong there. But I want to look at a 5-county region in Minnesota as just an example, and then we're going to look at how this happens. In this 5-county region of western Minnesota, prairie land, very similar to Kansas, Nebraska, their population from 1960 to 2010 went down by 35%, from 69,000 people to 45,000 people, down 35%, right? Big losers these people are. They continue to lose people. Obviously, people don't want to live there, and they're flooding away. But wait a minute. Look at the number of households. The number of households went up by 3%. Well, how can that be? Let me show you. Now, imagine, how big was the average household in 1960? It might have been like 3.2 kids, but by 2010, it's down to like 1.5. So I'm just going to use this example here of, you know, in 1970, the average household was 2 parents and 2 kids, where today it's 2 parents and 1 kid. So what's the effect here? Your population goes down by 1, but your household looks the same. It's just the number of people in that home has gotten smaller. So what happens over these time periods too, is that you may have had 2 children in the household, but the 2 kids graduate, right? Well, now what happens? Your population goes down by 2, but the number of households stays the same. You may have had 2 senior spouses and one of them passes away, but the surviving spouse stays in their home. Well, what happened? Your population just went down by 1, but the number of households stayed the same. Sometimes a senior passes away and then the family holds onto the house for a period of time. Your population again goes down by 1, but the households stays the same. This is part and parcel of what we've got going on across rural America. It is a change in household structure. I'm going to be in Kansas there on Tuesday, and I'm just going to point out, like Decatur County, Kansas, your population between 2000 and 2010 went down by 15%, but the number of households changed 0%. You were stable. That should be a measure of success, right? Not the minus 15% population, because you don't have control over these households, right? Yeah, I mean, just because like Bill and Sherry's kids graduated, you're not like, hey, you mind if I move 2 more people into town, into the kid's bedroom, like, right? Or a spouse loses their partner, you're not gonna like, hey, you know, you mind if I have somebody else move in with you, because total population means more to me than anything else. I hope you see this. So that's just a couple examples, like Logan County, 10% population loss, but a 1% gain in households. Lincoln County, 9% population loss, a 1% gain in households. Rooks County, 9% population loss, no change in number of households. Sheridan County, minus 9%. I mean, this is the story of rural population change. It is a change in household structure. It is not a movement of everybody away from our small towns. Sorry, I don't have the chat window open here. Give me a moment. I want to be monitoring chat a little bit. Chat, sorry. Okay, so one of the first data points I hit was that on average in Minnesota, I was looking at Minnesota, but Kansas has the same rate. In any 5-year time period, roughly 46% of your households are moving every 5 years. Now, this was 95 to 99. The census didn't track this nearly as reliably in the 2010 census. But really, these numbers are not far off. It's down by like 2 to 3 points because migration slowed for a number of reasons. So even so, like even if it were 40%, like 4 in 10 of your households are moving every 5 years, meaning you've got people moving in and moving out. And I thought, you know what, we really don't have a good idea of who really is moving in and out of our small towns. So we're going to look at, for the sake of time, I'm going to get through some of this. These are some charts I had initially made. Like here's Grant County, Minnesota. And if the bar goes to the right, that means this age group got bigger over this 10-year time frame. And if it goes to the left, that means people left in this age group over the past 10 years. And if you looked at county population for Grant County, this is a small county on the prairie, about just over 6,000 people. They're not near a metropolitan area. And if you looked at their total population, it was flat, right? But what's going on? Like we have this brain drain, right? Yep. Grant County loses 40% of their 20 to 24-year-olds. And really what happens, because, you know, 10 years ago, this group was 10 to 14 years old. Now they're 20 to 24. What happened in that 10-year time frame? Graduation. 43% of the young people leave. But this is what I found in almost every rural county in the country. There is a gain in 30, 40, and sometimes 50-year-olds. And there's a gain in 10 to 14-year-olds. And obviously these 10 to 14-year-olds, they don't move by themselves. They're coming with their parents. And then we ended up developing a typical profile of a rural prairie county. Again, you've got total population loss because of a change in household structure, but there's people moving in to your counties in their 30s and 40s, sometimes a loss in the 50s, and then they're bringing in kids that are 10 to 14, which are typically in 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And they are helping to reinvigorate our small towns. Now imagine this. Now just walk back in this, like what would have happened to your small towns if when the young people left and when people migrated out, if nobody ever came back, if nobody ever moved into your towns would have been dead 80 years ago. So obviously we had to have had somebody moving in to keep these communities viable. And so again, like here's the brain drain. This is almost the headline, right? This is what books and articles are written about, is the brain drain. Yep, but what about this, right? Like, wait a minute here. There's people in their 30s and 40s moving in. Who's writing about this? Who's talking about this? Recreational counties, they see great growth too. They lose their young people after high school graduation, 30% of them on average. But these people are also bringing their kids with. Here's a core metropolitan county. This is like Wichita. This is the metropolitan profile for every metro county in the country except for Los Angeles. Where do the young people go? But more importantly, who do they not hold on to? Like, I think there's an idea out there that the metro areas are like giant sucking sounds and everybody wants to move to the metro. But in reality, what you find is the metropolitan areas only capture people in 3 very narrow age groups, from 15, really post-high school graduation, up through 30. And if they don't capture them before that, they don't capture them. So ultimately, we've kind of seen this. The metropolitan areas have been fairly stagnant and flat in their population since 1970. So again, here's the total population map of all the losers, right, in these counties here in white. But now let's look at where do we have these gains in people in their 30s. Look at this. Here's the population change overall, but here's where people are moving in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Now, there is no relationship between population loss and gains. So at the time, my colleague Randy Cantrell in Nebraska, Randy used to be in Extension in Minnesota. I love Randy. And I called Randy. I was like, man, Randy, look at this data. It looks like people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s are moving in, even in like the Panhandle of Nebraska, where there's a 10 to 15% population loss every year. So as good academics, right, got a grant, and Randy did studies in Nebraska, I did studies in Minnesota, and we interviewed and did focus groups with all these newcomers, i.e. people that moved to our rural communities in the past 5 years. So Randy and Cheryl really spearheaded the effort there. They had called this project the Buffalo Commons Research Project in Nebraska. And we asked people pretty basic questions like, why did you move here, right? Top 3 reasons that people gave were, number 1 was simpler pace of life. Number 2, safety and security. And number 3 was the low cost of housing. Now, nowhere in the top 5 in Nebraska nor the top 10 in Minnesota was a job. Now, this might be troubling. If you're an economic developer, we typically have a jobs first approach to recruiting people to our region. But what this tells us is, and what we had found out, is that these newcomers look at anywhere between 3 to 5 towns to move to in a huge region. They kind of draw this huge triangle between regional centers and say, I want to live between here and here and here. And they start to look at parks. They start to look at schools. They start to look at homes. And it's only when they narrow it down to the top 2 or 3 towns that they seriously start looking for a job. Now, this is going to become even more important as we are in the tightest labor market and only going to get worse than we have ever known. So how do you do job recruitment when labor has power? Labor is going to have a tremendous amount of power over the next 15 years here to dictate where they live. I want to remind you that people don't live in an economy, they live in a community. And how do they choose that community, which ultimately leads to a contribution to the economy? So what we call this is a people attraction strategy. It goes alongside of our, kind of industrial recruitment strategy, but this is much more geared and not just helping people to envision their job in their new town, it's to envision their lives. So who are these newcomers? Initially, I would say, I think we thought roughly 3/4 of the new people to a small town grew up there. We thought it was going to be kids returning to their small towns. But what we found is just 1/3 of the newcomers had lived there before. Put another way, 2/3 of newcomers in your rural communities are not from there. Now, moving is a scary thing. Now, if you know somebody in town, it can still be scary, right? If your family, your aunt's there, you've got family there, like it's still pretty scary because you don't know how it's going to go, or you're going to meet friends, all this kind of stuff. But now put yourself into the shoes of a true newcomer that doesn't know anybody in a town of 500 people. If your, furnace goes out at 2 a.m, who do you call? Like if you have like that strong social network there, you're going to call my aunt who knows somebody and they're going to come out and help me out. But if you don't know anybody, who do you call? If you need emergency daycare, who do you call? We just have very few opportunities to truly welcome newcomers into our small towns because we really don't have opportunities for social engagement like we used to. right? The kind of third places that the Oldenburg talks about. Like, we lose these kind of cafes and places for people to aggregate and congregate. So ultimately, how do people get welcomed in? They don't. We used to have welcome wagons, but the post office can't just hand out a list of all the people that moved in. So how do you truly find newcomers in our community? And I like to ask, like, raise your hand if you've had a newcomer over for a meal in the past year. And that number is generally less than 5%. I think there's just been a shift that, people used to be outgoing. We used to be excited to go out, and now we're excited to be home. So I think there's a lot of shift in these social realms that impact, how these newcomers experience their town for the first number of years. What we also found is just half of newcomers have kids. So, if you've got kids, you will quickly notice the newcomer families when you've got new kids in your class, in your kids' class, and then their parents are at some event. You're like, hey, welcome to town, But I will say that every time you see a newcomer household with kids, there's another that doesn't. So really, what we had found is that a lot of times just quality of life trumped everything. People just wanted, we heard this repeatedly, they wanted control over their lives. They didn't want to be in a commute. They wanted a slower pace of life. They want to measure their commute in, miles, where miles equal minutes, all right? As opposed to 3 miles equals 40 minutes. So essentially, we have a lot of these dynamics that lead people to look to lower density areas to live. So essentially, people are moving all the time. On average, people move 12 times during their lifetime, 6 times by the age of 30. So all of these become opportunities to capture newcomers in our small towns. So I'm going to call this the brain gain, right? I'm going to get over this negative narrative about the brain drain because ultimately, I'll compare the two. I'll just do this, right? On one hand, what's the brain drain? We lose a high school student with a high school degree, with very, uncertain career path, not a lot of education, not a lot of experience, not a lot of social or economic networks. But on the other hand, we're bringing in people in their 30s and 40s, sometimes 50s. They have had a career or are in the middle of their career. And like Randy says, like these are people in their prime earning years. And they have chosen to take a lot of times a pay cut to move to our rural communities because it's worthwhile to them. It's not always an economic rationale as to why you move anywhere. And we are going to see this even more exposed here over the next 25 years. So really, brain drain, when you lose your kids, that's the rule. Like, don't beat yourselves up over losing your kids. But really, if the narrative in your small town is negative, your kids are never going to see your small town as a place they can come back to. So this is where the narrative starts to fit in. So I kind of say our employee recruitment must get past warm body syndrome. Like, we can't just have a jobs first approach to employee recruitment, because ultimately these people moving in, it's more than a job that they want to hear about. So if all you're doing is kind of touring the shop floor and telling them what their benefit packages are, that's not helping them envision their life here. We have in Otter Tail County right now here in Minnesota, so we've been doing this research for almost 14 years now, and we've had about a dozen people recruitment efforts sprout up across the state. And Otter Tail County here in Minnesota hired a rural rebound coordinator. And all he does is he works with employers to help potential employees envision their life here. He will show people the hot fishing spots. He will show them where the golf courses are, where hunting can take place, right? It's everything but the job. He also does kind of integration techniques too. We've got ambassadors in every town across the county. It's their job to actually find newcomers and take them out for a meal. It is not their job to ask them to sit on a board. It's not their, which is probably the most effective way to turn people off from social engagement, is to ask them right off the bat to sit on a board. But, we're not going to talk a ton about that. But we will talk a little bit about leadership, which is now part 2 of this presentation on the rural narrative. So Alexis de Tocqueville was kind of blown away. He was a Frenchman who traveled the eastern seaboard of the U.S., who was amazed at American life. And one of the things he wrote about in his book called Democracy in America here, which was published in 1831, is he was amazed that, whenever Americans were confronted with a challenge, they would kind of form these associations and they'd rise up and meet these challenges and then dissipate back down into everyday life. And when the next challenge came about, they would band back together, form an association, and meet that challenge. And this is a really great model for how to conquer social and economic problems in your community. But what's the one part of this model that we never do? Dissipate. Like literally, when's the last time your nonprofit group was like, hey, you know, we achieved our mission, let's close up shop, right? You know, a lot of times when groups are successful or they're mission driven, they get into mission drift. Like, hey, as long as we've got all these people here, let's just start doing this then, right? So ultimately, we've got this kind of complexity of social life. And it's many times under this headline of social life is dying. You know, it's that people don't care. Honestly, I would hear this quite a bit about the newcomers. Whenever I would present upon the brain gain early on, I would have people in town say, well, if there's all these new people, I just don't believe it. You know, there's not new people here. If there were all these new people here, where are they? They're not coming to my groups. They're not involved. They're not coming to the chamber meeting. They're not coming, you know, right to the school board meetings. Where are they? And I say, you're right. They're not coming to your meetings. They're going to theirs. And you're not going to theirs. So we need to be very careful about how you express your kind of comments on how you believe people should be spending their time. So, you know, many of you know Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. We talk about social capital. And his premise here is that social capital is in decline. And he uses an indicator of, you know, it used to be that people would bowl in leagues, and now they're bowling alone. And my kind of point is, well, why are we looking at bowling alleys, right? Bowling alleys, you know, we lost 60% of our bowling alleys in this country since 1970. So maybe we should be looking to where people are spending their time. So this whole idea of social vibrancy kind of hit me when I asked one question. How many people do we need to run our town? Is the very simple question. And what we do is I want to look at supply and demand here. So essentially, people provide supply for leadership, like positional leaders, right? Every school board, every nonprofit, you have to have people actually supply leaders. And so on the demand side, it's organizations, and on the supply side, it's people. So let's look at demand. On the demand side, there's kind of two pieces to this. Not only do we have all these kind of governmental units, we have, right, cities, counties, townships, cemetery districts, school districts, SWCDs, sewer system districts. Like, we've got all these kind of governmental agencies which require, you know, local residents to either run for or be appointed to positions and, you know, kind of run the town. But at the same time, we also have this nonprofit sector. So I ran across this very, very cool database from the National Center for Charitable Statistics that gives us the number of nonprofits, and you can drill down by type and by county on the number of nonprofits. And this was really the first chart I made, which was like, man, the number of nonprofits in this country goes up by 10 to 15% every 5 years. Well, this doesn't tell the story of social decline. If social life was dying out, you should expect to see a decline in all these numbers, but we don't. So I thought I had, oh shoot, I put it in here. The Kansas numbers are very similar to this. Actually, I think this is the Kansas numbers. Sorry, guys. I just have my Minnesota slide in here, right? This is the Kansas number. So overall, from 2000 to 2010, the Kansas population went up by 6%, but the number of nonprofits went up by 18%. And in the most rural counties, and this was amazing, in Kansas, the population went down by 10%, but the number of nonprofits went up by 22%. Well, I thought social life was in decline. What's going on here? So what we find is that there have been great gains in the number of nonprofits across this country. In fact, the numbers that we see in the Midwest are actually some of the smaller numbers. And initially this confused me because I thought, no way is the southeastern part of the country surpassing the Midwest, where we have some of the highest rates of voting, home ownership, social capital, civic engagement, right? Like, wow, how is this happening? What we found is that kind of per capita, the number of nonprofits in the upper Midwest is still well beyond the rate of nonprofits in the Southeast. So, and we'll look at some of this in just a minute here. And on a county by county basis, we see there's only, 4 or 5 counties across the whole state that experience losses in the number of nonprofits. But again, just because you experience overall loss doesn't mean you're losing everybody. you may have gained 4 groups, but you lost 5. So now you're down 1. So that's a negative. But ultimately, even in the most rural counties across this state, you're seeing pretty tremendous growth. Now, I think there's an interesting policy examination that needs to be done here, because look at how these change at the county line, or sorry, at the state line. Like Nebraska, there is something going on here that is leading to the differentiation of social engagement really at the state level. Not really sure what it is, but becomes, a question that we may have about the data. So just a few examples here. Graham County, Kansas, your population went down by 12%. The nonprofits went up by 44%. Phillips County, your population went down by 6%. Number of nonprofits went up by 48%. So that's just an example. If you want the chart for your county, I am more than happy to share that with you. And we've got another set of data here on revenue and assets and some other pieces that I can share with you too. So my email will be available at the end. So now let's look at the supply side. So this is the demand side, right? Your groups are increasing at a rate that well exceeds population growth. And if you just think about this, like, holy cow, there's going to be a lot of competition for people. And so let's look at some of the supply side of things, like i.e. people. In our rural communities, we have had a diversification of our social life too. And as a rural sociologist, I love to look at the types of nonprofits you've got in your county. Because in many ways, nonprofits don't just come in from the outside and plop themselves down in your county. People create nonprofits around their interests. So they say, like, we want to do X and we're going to create a group around this. And we have seen this general pattern since the early, in the mid 1800s. We called them associations. They weren't as formalized, I would say, as, 501c3 organizations, but there still were opportunities for people to aggregate. But then we kind of talk today about what changes have taken place. And when we talk about young people, it's always kind of negative, right? And so we talk about, and I hear about, sadly, the entitled millennials, the selfish young people, like, this is doing nobody any good. I will encourage you to never use the language around entitlement for a younger generation when you've just witnessed a population growing up that saw their parents go underwater in their home, to watch an economic restructuring that lost a tremendous amount of jobs. I mean, we've had a very astute group of young people growing up right now, and they are not going to make the same mistakes the previous generations did. But meanwhile, as a part of this narrative that we have about young people is that they're selfish. There's a gap, like they just don't understand the world. They don't care about the community. And we see these headlines in periodicals. So like the generation gap in 1968, the me decade in 1976, 20-somethings in 1990, generational warfare. It's all about me, the me generation. Like literally, you can use the same cover every 5 to 10 years to talk about the younger generation. But I want to remind you, the baby boomers, you were called selfish too by your parents when you were 18 to 25 years old. Being interested and focused on yourself is not a trait of a generation, it's a trait of an age. So again, we need to be very careful about how we talk about how these young people are expressing their interests, because ultimately then we are not seeing where they're involved. So what has happened, and there's a major shift here that's happened in terms of social engagement. So historically, people would be involved in a place-based group that was broadly focused. So my example here would be like the Hancock Community Betterment Club. It served everybody in town, right? It served the firemen to, build a new fire station or raise money for a fire truck or help the church rebuild or build a senior center or fundraise for the school playground, whatever it was, right? It was broadly focused, but it didn't serve everybody. The Hancock Community Betterment Club didn't help Morris out to the north. It was only Hancock, right? So now, these are the historical ways that people would be involved. Today, people want to be involved in just the opposite. Rather than a narrow geography, it's a wide geography. And rather than a wide focus, it's a narrow focus. So instead of the Hancock Community Betterment Club, it's the West Central Minnesota Bicycle Association or the canoeing group or whatever it is, right? There's a really rich, when you start looking at the types of nonprofits in your communities, and sometimes, by the way, these nonprofits don't exist in your county. They exist in the neighboring county because these groups cover such wide geographic areas that you don't really have a home for that group because they get together to meet in a 300 square mile area, if not more. So essentially, there's all these changes that are taking place in how people want to be involved socially. And we know this, that nationally, there's growth in certain types of nonprofits: arts, education, recreation, philanthropy, religion related, by the way, is an artifact. We know the number of churches has been in decline, but not all churches have been required to file with the IRS. They were not all required to be a 501c blank organization, but many churches are now becoming official organizations because they want to be able to give out grants or receive grants. So this is an artifact of these organizations wanting to gain some validity at the state level. So essentially, we know where this growth is, and it looks different. And like, here's the Eagles and Lions clubs right here. There's declines in certain types of groups. So either union groups or mutual benefit groups have been in decline. So what are the implications here? I'm going to skip over some of this. The implications here is that, a lot of times new residents are more than warm bodies. And how do we treat these new people when they get to town? Like, a lot of time we treat them like warm bodies, like, hey, welcome to town. We need a school board member. I know you have kids, so you're ready to serve, kinds of things. But in how our groups operate, there are also some changes too. These younger people, they desire decentralized approaches to leadership. So it used to be, you have somebody in charge of the fair, and then you have 4 committees, and you spend your time at the meeting having every committee update the entire group. I mean, this is just not a useful use of time. Generally, you have to have some level of trust. These young people, they prefer task forces, not the kind of, command and control committee structures. They also desire what I call simplified methods of communication. And what I mean by simple is actually more complex, because ultimately, if you're going to have a community supper, how do you get the word out? Well, we put it in the newspaper. Okay, well, for a majority of the population now, is that on the website? Okay, now, oh no, we also put it on the radio, right? Okay, well, I don't know. I listen to Pandora on my phone. It's not really the radio. So, all right. So, is it on Facebook? You're over the age of 35. Do you email over the age of 40? Right. The number one effective method for communication and engagement is a text message, especially with newcomers. But what predisposes a text message is a relationship. You can't just cold text somebody to town because you happen to get their, I don't even know how you get their number, right? Because welcome wagons, we don't have them anymore. We don't generally even know where the people are. We generally don't even know where these newcomers live because it's dark for 6 months out of the year. When we wake up in the morning and get home, we wouldn't even know if somebody new moved in across the street until the spring. And we're like, hey, I don't recognize that person. So anyway, there are these new people that move to town. We don't always know how to engage them. And that they may be interested in things that are not interesting to you. And we need to recognize this kind of diversity that we've got in our social structures. And before we start projecting what we believe people want, we need to stop and listen to what they desire in the community. So what's kind of the conclusion here of the supply-demand model is that there's just an increased competition in your town. When you see the number of nonprofits grow the way they are, you're competing for leaders, for volunteers, for donations. And many times these groups in town, they don't really accommodate newcomers. It's like, oh, you want to join our group? And then, okay, here's the 6 things we do every year. Which one are you going to sign up for? Well, there's no way for some of these newcomers to actually express their skills, express their interests and values unless we make room for them. So back to the rural narrative. So the Pew Research Institute did a study a number of years ago that asked people, all right, Americans, we know that just 20% of you live in a rural place and 80% of you are in an urban place. But if you could choose to live anywhere, where would you like to live? 51% of Americans said they would prefer to live in a rural area or a small town. Well, why don't they? I argue here that the narrative about our rural communities is so negative, people believe they never could. You know, it's like, I could never be a farmer. Well, we have more than farming jobs available, right? And a lot of times we have people fill in the blank. You can be a blank in rural Kansas. You can be an engineer. You can be a book editor. You can be a publisher. Like, right? Every job is available. Every occupational area and every industry is reflected in rural areas. It's not everywhere, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So really, there is a national societal preference to live in small towns and rural places. Certainly not everybody is leaving our small towns, and certainly not everybody is flocking to the city. And in many ways, we see this kind of new urbanity in our rural communities because, you know, we've seen the rise of these regional centers. So I like to look at migration. I like to talk to newcomers. I like to really kind of drill down into the reasoning why they chose that town. And I want to remind you, when your narrative is wholly negative, when your narrative in your community is based upon the past or what you could have had or what you should have had, honestly, the newcomers, they don't want to hear it. Of all the interviews and focus groups we've done, none of the newcomers have ever said they moved to your town for pity. Nobody said, hey, I moved to your town. I know you lost your grocery store 35 years ago. I'm here to help you out, right? Nobody ever says that. And it's not that they don't and won't care about your past, but when you just move to a town, it is not your concern, the history of the town. But, you know, what do newcomers hear when they move to town? Like, a lot of times their first comment is like, why would you move here? As if there's nothing here. Or like, you know, you're not really from here until you've been here for 30 years. Well, let's continue the disrespect, right? Like, let's just talk more disrespectfully about these people who uprooted their lives. They're bringing their career, they're bringing their education, their economic networks, their kids a lot of times to your communities. And I think they demand more respect than we give them. So I'm going to end with this, that today, like, you can't say you don't see this coming right now. After I say this next thing, prepare for one of the largest demographic changes to rural America since 1930. Right now, 75% of rural homeowners across your communities are baby boomers and older. A more dramatic number is that, and this is actually 75 years old, 30% of your homes today are owned by people over the age of 75. They are not going to live in these homes forever. So literally 30% of your housing is going to turn over in the next like 10 years. And are you ready for it? Is the house ready for it? So there is another presentation I do. I'm going to actually be in Hayes on Tuesday presenting on moving in, moving out, and moving over. How to examine these kind of household structure changes and the potentials for growth in your community over the next 25 years as these people move out and we make room for the newcomers to move in. So why does this narrative matter? It doesn't, it doesn't have to matter to you, but I want to tell you the number one audience for a negative narrative in your town are your kids. They hear this. When you continually tell them that there's nothing for them here or that they need to get out to succeed, they are going to believe that. And sometimes they will have no desire to ever come back. So essentially, if you continually tell them that, they are never going to see your town as a place to potentially come back to. So rural, people are making a choice here. They're moving into our rural communities. They're not being forced to move. They're choosing. They're moving in. They're creating groups. They're building their community. They're diversifying the economy. They're buying and starting businesses. They're working from home. They're living in a region, a huge region, which I call living in the middle of everywhere, which is another exercise I could share with you at some point. But that is, again, against the negative narrative that I live in the middle of nowhere. When actually you live in the middle of everywhere, of all of these places where you live and work and shop and play. And you're certainly more than warm bodies. The bottom line is people want to live and move to your towns for what you are today and will be tomorrow, not what may have been. So in my view, rural revitalization is upon us. Like, there is a reason for you to be positive about your small towns, and now you've got the data behind it. You cannot be called Pollyannish because you're positive about your small town. You should be positive, and you've got good reason for it. So really, thank you again, Nancy, for the opportunity to share this research here with the group. Again, if you want a custom profile for your county data, shoot me an email here. I'll get it probably in the next week and a half back to you. But yeah, I think we've got time for questions here today.
Fantastic. If you want to ask a question, please open your microphone, unmute yourself, and ask a question. We're getting some messages in the chat box about how refreshing it is to have a new perspective on and some real data, some anecdata to share with others. In fact, this will change some of the data and how I presented in my first impressions reviews.
Right. Well, thank you folks for the kind words.
Yes.
Have the numbers changed over the last 10 years? Lots of change to total rural population and mobility. Yeah, so mobility has gone down. But really right now, and I'll be getting into this in Hayes in terms of this housing presentation I do. But right now, around housing is kind of the limiting factor here. And you know, in your small towns, a lot of times there just aren't a lot of homes available. And many times those homes don't even go on the market because you're like, hey, Mark and Cindy's home, they're going to put it out. They're interested in selling. We're just going to buy it, right? And it never goes on the market. Well, I argue right now that the housing decisions that are made by our seniors it's a policy of best intentions, is what I call it. And that our seniors have a policy of, I'm going to live in my house forever. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a policy. That's a desire. And meanwhile, so folks go through this kind of model of residential decision-making, and many times we've got a ton of incentives right now to stay in our house. We have these age-in-place programs, but age-in-place should not mean age in your home. Because a lot of times seniors, and I'm not talking about seniors with medical needs, I'm talking about seniors, I call it the continuum of life before the continuum of care. Like you retire and you've got this long span of time that you want to, you don't always want to be in the 3-bedroom, 2-story, 2-bath house. You want to be in something that's really lower, smaller, less maintenance, things like that. But ultimately, if you don't have anywhere for your seniors to move over to, they're either going to stay in their home and the home may be impacted by no maintenance because you're on a fixed income, or your seniors are going to move out. So this, for me, really becomes a call to arms for our communities to talk to your seniors, actually engage seniors in a conversation about their residential decisions. Because right now, there is nobody having this conversation with them. Right now, a lot of it is like our seniors saying, well, I'm going to put in a handicap accessible bathroom and a ramp on the house, and they just spent $6,000 because they live in a world of best intentions. And then literally 9 months later, they can't live there anymore. And then they go to sell the house and they can't because it's got peeling paint or it's got knob and tube wiring, or right, we have no idea what kind of condition these homes are in. So then it really, our housing decisions are almost always made in emergency mode. Like, boy, we got to sell the house for our senior parent, right? Or whatever it is. And then you just don't have the kind of interest and concern that you really need to have in order to understand. And here's my big point. Housing is more than a private asset. It's a community asset, because that home is going to exist after that senior passes on. So in many ways, when I hear about workforce housing shortages, I say there's no workforce housing shortage. You've got plenty of workforce housing. It's currently occupied by your seniors. And as soon as they start, it's the churn of homes. So as soon as those people start moving out, we've got room for people to move in. So again, 30% of your homes are going to be turning over in the next 10 years.
Very good. Well, we have a few questions and comments. Want to reassure you or remind you that the call is recorded. Ben is going to share with me his PowerPoints so that you can look at those and refer to them. Ben, are you checking out the comments to see whether there's some things that you want to comment on there?
Yeah, so the Talk in Hayes, I don't believe is going to be available. Let's see.
It's
so
closed.
Hayes,
It's closed at this point.
This is for the Dane G. Hansen Foundation. It's not a kind of an extension-wide event that's going on there. So why do you think discussions about rural issues have become so prevalent of late? Because of national politics. And it hasn't always been a positive conversation about rural. But I'm glad there's more attention being placed on rural. There's been more attention being placed on rural in terms of politics. The philanthropy sector has definitely had more interest in rural communities lately too. So, and in many ways, like Wichita, like it's kind of funny because folks from LA and New York think Wichita is a small town. So like the entire swath of the country in the center part, aside from Chicago, is rural. So I think everything's kind of relative in many ways there. What I expect to see in the new 2020 census, more of the same, really. I think the brain gain trend is slowed because our housing stocks are so filled up. Our housing stocks are so filled up, and unless we really find models for getting people out and into a more appropriate housing, there's just not room for new families to move in. So I expect the brain gain trend to continue where it can.
So ever since I was exposed to you by one of my Dame G. Henson colleagues, Nadine, the only thing I knew about your research I learned from a YouTube video, and so I've been starting to talk a little bit about brain gain and housing. But the thing that is interesting to me in the 40 communities that I've done first impressions meetings at, and there have been, you know, usually around 30 to 40 people in every audience, and I say, how many of you meet that description of brain gainers? And they do. I mean, I have always had people in the audience, not just a small number, a really significant number of people who would describe themselves as those people who chose to be in this community.
Right. Same here, Nancy. Like every time I present this on the brain gain, I always see people nodding their head, right? And then afterward, they're like, that's me. Like, that is exactly my story. So Neil Lynch and I, we call this the best $150 ever spent. And it is a newcomer supper in your community. And it's not for everybody. It is only for newcomers, because ultimately, the number one outcome out of this is newcomers saying, like, I can't believe how many other new people there are. Like as if, you know, they were on an island alone, and because we don't have these opportunities for social engagement, they don't know who other new people are, in a sense. And so it becomes a really positive outcome because, you know, human beings, we're social creatures. We don't need to organize life for people. We just need to put them together. Randy and I, we always say this, like, you know, we over the decades, we have called this model of community engagement something different, but the bottom line is it's interaction. Getting community residents to interact is the only predictor for success in our community development efforts. We call it different things, but it essentially is get people together and you will get outcomes. So
that's fantastic. Well, we usually like to give a moment for people to share. Ron Wilson reminds us all that the Rural Opportunity Conference will be April 2nd through 4th. And where will it be, Ron?
April 2nd and 3rd in Dodge City.
April 2nd and 3rd in Dodge City. I had another request to get information out, and I'm sorry I've got too many things on my screen to share that, but I will send it out with the link to the call afterwards. Does anybody else have anything you'd like to share for the good of the order? Okay, well, next month, our speaker on the First Friday phone call will be Andy Stanton. He is the remarkably rural project coordinator with GenRest Productions in Cortland, Kansas. And as Ben says, everyone needs to know how to use your social media. And his topic is effective use of social media for rural organizations. That speaker is in April, the first Friday of April. And so I leave you today with a thought for the day. Author Patrick Overton wrote, "When we walk to the edge of all the light we have, and we take a step into the darkness of the unknown, we must believe that one of two things will happen. There will be something solid for us to stand on, or we will be taught to fly." And I have not read these books, but I want to read this one just based on the title. It's called Rebuilding the Front Porch of America, Essays on the Art of Community Making. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you next month, and look for the link to the video. Thanks, Ben.